Welcome to Globe Summit, the Globe's annual conference that brings together the biggest thinkers and innovators and change makers. Thank you to all of us who are joining us in studio and in person at WBUR CitySpace and also virtually. I'm Shirley Leung. I'm a business columnist at the Boston Globe. I'm also the co-host, the only host, I should say, of a new podcast called Say More with Globe Opinion. Listen wherever you find your podcasts. This session is called How do we fix AI's diversity problem? And we have about half an hour to go over a huge problem and to discuss this huge topic. I've got questions for our panelists, but we also want to hear from you. So if you're joining us virtually, please look to the right side of your screen and you can submit questions. If you're in studio, submit questions at Slido, #GlobesSummit. So here with us in studio today, we have Dr. Marzieh Qasimi. She's an assistant professor at MIT in electrical engineering and computer science. Oh, you get applause.
Thank you.
I love it.
Wait, I'm not finished with her titles. She's also at the Institute for Medical Engineering and Science. One of her areas of expertise is studying the biases in machine learning in health data, such as medical images and clinical notes. Next to her in studio is Melissa James. She is the founder and CEO of Tech Connection, a recruitment platform that helps tech companies diversify their workforces. She is a former Googler, and she worked on a team that recruited underrepresented software engineers. Now, Melissa, being Melissa, knew there was a better way, so that is why she started Tech Connection. And joining us virtually is Raman Chaudhry. Raman is the former director of a team at Twitter, which identified and mitigated algorithmic harms on the platform. She is now a responsible AI fellow at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center, and runs Parity Consulting. So, Raman, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you, everyone. So let's get started. So I can't remember who came up with the title of this panel, but it's actually spot on. Because I think a lot of people think AI is a diversity problem as being in the future, but the future is now. I mean, these large language model AI systems, even in their infancy, already exhibit bias. And Marzieh, I was hoping you could start us off talking about, kind of helping us set the table, explaining why AI already has a diversity and inclusion problem.
Sure. So the way to think about this is to think about how you're training AI, right? So if you're training a system, the way that you do it in modern machine learning is you don't give it rules to follow, because that's crazy. It's very difficult to specify every single rule and every single situation that you might have to follow. And instead, the reason we have these really fantastic machine learning systems that can do things we didn't think were possible a few years ago even, is because we say, let's not try to do these instructions. Just watch everything we do. Look at every example of text that we've written. Listen to all of the speech we have. Learn by example. And surely if you can mimic us, then you will be a reasonable system. The problem is these systems really are mimicking us. And what I mean by that is when we audit machine learning systems that have been trained on text data, they exhibit really pernicious biases that mimic societal biases. So if you can imagine a human having a bad opinion about a certain subgroup of people, large language models hold that opinion as well when probed. And so we see the same thing in health data. So if you can imagine that there is a bias that is held by society, some doctors probably hold it as well. And so what we're seeing with large language models is a specific example of the larger problem in AI of what happens when we use lots and lots of data that has bias in it and that maybe you would not want replicated, but is in fact replicated when you say just use the data that's available.
So Marzieh, is it as simple as if we just clean up the data, then everything will be fair and equitable in AI?
If you had perfect data, yes. If humans could somehow generate perfect data from a perfect society, then yes, we would have fair and equitable AI. I don't think that's coming anytime soon. So if we can't clean up society and have perfect processes to learn from in our financial system, our education system, our judicial system, our healthcare system, then we need to find better ways of learning which data to learn from or auditing models prior to deployment so that we know what the biases are.
So, Raman, when you were at Twitter, you had a team that studied biases and looking for biases in the algorithms. I was wondering if you can give us some examples of some of the work you did there and explain, like, how do algorithms become biased and what do you do to fix them?
What a great question. Also, hello from UN General Assembly, where the topic of conversation is artificial intelligence, which is why I can't be with you all in person. So during my time at Twitter and kind of related, one of the ways in which algorithmic bias would manifest on a social media platform, people were concerned, was amplification of political perspectives. So, we would get feedback that people on the left thought that right-wing content would be amplified, people on the right claiming that they're being shadow banned. So we did an empirical test of this, and this paper was published in a scientific journal, PNAS, and we did an analysis that actually demonstrated that the algorithmic content was amplifying center-right content over what's called reverse chronological. So the way an algorithm on social media works is it picks content that looks like things that you would want to see. And I want to emphasize that these algorithms are not designed to demonstrate or show you a particular kind of content. It is trained on the kinds of things you might want to see, and it learns it in a sense almost agnostically, right? So an algorithm does not differentiate between whether you're liking cute cat videos or whether you're liking Donald Trump's tweets, right? However, algorithmic bias can play a role because even if it's not explicitly built into an algorithm, for example, highlight particular perspectives, the societal biases, as was very clearly explained by the previous panelists, can manifest themselves. And I'll give you a different example of work we did. We actually did an analysis of the algorithm that used to crop images on Twitter. So if you remember, people online, this is a perfect example of citizen data science, saw that the algorithm seemed to be cropping towards light-skinned faces. And just to fast forward through the analysis we did, what it turns out is that the fundamental algorithm was based on something called saliency, which is human eye tracking data. So they would get lots and lots of people, and in order to train an algorithm, they'd show them pictures, and they would track where their eyes would go, what they would look at. So you can imagine, oh, that sounds very scientific, very, agnostic and data-driven. Yes, however, guess what people like to look at? People like to look at young, pretty white women. And as a result, our saliency model would crop towards lighter skinned individuals, women, in particular, younger people. And we demonstrated that not only in our analysis, but actually we opened up our model to the public in a challenge for individuals to provide us feedback on how we can improve and demonstrate new biases. And it actually reinforced that, the human biases and the human predilection and the way we are trained to look at women, in particular young white women, as the icon of beauty translates into a cropping algorithm on a social media platform.
And you were able to fix that? Can you fix it?
We actually, so it is, well, what a great question. Okay, so what does it mean to even fix that? Right? So what is the ideal? What should it be cropping towards? We don't actually know. So I'll give you the example. It's ultimately what Twitter ended up doing. Well, this is Twitter, not the current platform, ended up actually getting rid of the algorithm. And one of the reasons is, it's hard to figure out what it is somebody wants centered in a picture. So just an example, if you have a child, right? Let's say there's a picture of your kid and 5 of their friends. And if you were to crop the photo, you'd crop to your child's picture. But there's no way for this algorithm to know what who your child is and how to crop it appropriately, right? So there really was no way, like while it is well-intentioned, and I think, makes sense from a purely scientific standpoint, from a human perspective, it actually didn't make sense to keep it. An interesting positive externality is the photography community was extremely thrilled that we got rid of auto cropping because photographers spend a lot of time framing the perfect shot. And they always felt like they could never share their media on Twitter because it would auto crop to something that they did not intend to have as the image.
All right, one last question on this topic before I go to Melissa, which is, so Raman, if your team wasn't looking for biases, if your company didn't ask you to check on this, I mean, it sounds like you have to be intentional about eliminating bias in AI. So how many companies or organizations actually do that?
That's a great question. So I would say all of the major tech platforms have some sort of approach to identifying harms and biases. And what's been introduced with, to varying degrees of success, I will say. I'll also add that during the last wave of tech layoffs, a lot of the individuals who work in, for example, trust and safety, response use, et cetera, were laid off. And that's, if I were to give it a charitable perspective, I would say it's because if they're cost cutting, these teams are seen as a cost center, not a revenue driver. So from a pure balance sheet perspective, it is not profitable to be spending on this, even though it actually is profitable, because ultimately these are the individuals that make your platform safe, that make your products usable. It's not directly linked that way. So a lot of those folks got laid off. That being said, generative AI has actually introduced a whole new set and wave of problems. So these models are general purpose. So rather than saying this specifically is an algorithm that decides where to crop a photo, it's more like OpenAI is building a general algorithm that you can then train to be everything from a math tutor to a music instructor. How on earth do you assess responsible and ethical use of something that's so broadly and widely used? So now there's been almost a reimagining or a shakeup of what it even means to build responsible AI, or how to inspect and audit algorithms, especially for large language models.
So Melissa, we've just heard about, I guess unintentional bias perhaps in health data collection, in social media. So what is it like in your world of recruiting? I mean, certainly employers use a lot of AI tools when they sift through, thousands of resumes online looking for candidates. So what are employers doing wrong? I know they're doing something wrong, right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, employers want what? They want to be able to hire a candidate quickly. They want someone with the right skills. So they're going to go in and type in marketing. Okay, great. Pull me up candidates that have great marketing skills. They want the cover letter. They want the resume that matches. And then they're going to say, okay, this is the right candidate to interview. However, we all know that just because I have a skill in marketing doesn't necessarily mean that I'm the best candidate for that role, for that project, for that size company. You have to really think through that, just because you have a skill doesn't necessarily mean you're the expert in that skill. So oftentimes companies are allowing the software platform to help them filter candidates out, but you just don't know which candidate's still the right fit for that particular position. So when employers are going through that process, not only are they looking at marketing candidates, they're also not thinking about who is this person as an individual? What's their personality like? Do they have the ability to work on complex problems? Do they have the ability to work on starting a project from scratch? You can't tell all of that by just typing in one keyword.
And so how do you make a better algorithm when you're recruiting? I mean, at Tech Connection, do you use AI in your line of work?
Oh, absolutely. We certainly do. And for me, I was a recruiter at Google for a long time. And what I learned was that it's not just about what's on their resume. In fact, we actually need to disrupt the resume and think differently about how we hire talent. So at Tech Connection, we base our hiring based off of their personal strengths, their core values, and where their curiosity is leading them. So they're able to share a little bit more about the projects that are interesting to them. By doing that, we're able to give you a report that shows you, here's how best to work with this particular candidate. This is what's on their mind right now. This is what they're curious about. Here are their strengths and here are their core values. Let's have a more meaningful conversation to make sure that we're aligning to your career and making those meaningful tech connections.
So let's stay on the topic of creating more diverse workforces in this AI space. Marzieh, how do you create a diversity or diverse work staff, or diverse staffing in your lab? How do you do that?
I think this is it's famously a pipeline problem that starts very early. So there's many studies that have established that young women specifically are discouraged from participating in STEM fields as early as middle school, right? So they're told you're not good at math, science isn't cool, we don't like engineering. There's been a lot of effort, I think, both regionally and nationally to combat that sort of bias. There's also a lot of systemic issues with different minorities not being given access to the same quality of education all throughout the school system. It's very difficult to address this issue at a graduate level, right? So if one PI cares about representation and says, I'm going to think really carefully about making sure that my lab is balanced, that's it. That's a very late stage of the game. It should be done, and I do try to make sure that when we do interviewing, we have a diversity of perspectives, backgrounds, values that are being represented, especially when we're talking about machine learning, healthcare, and ethics and bias. However, this is not something that we really should try to tackle only at the graduate level. We really do need to think about how we get to a place where there are enough people with the right skill set, with the right interest.
Sure. Yeah, I'm good. I have a mic. I don't need that one. Sorry. But, I think you're absolutely right. Like, having access to the right opportunities is important. While I worked at Google, I specifically looked at recruiting underrepresented talent from HBCUs. These are students that were super smart, super brilliant, but they didn't necessarily work at Twitter for their summer internships. That doesn't mean that candidate's not a good fit. It just means that they didn't have access or believe or even have the confidence that they could apply to Twitter for an internship. So there are so many reasons where we have to be more cognizant of the disparities that we go through in our education systems, what it's like at home. Did I have access to internet as a kid? Not every family does. If you're a low-income family and you're making less than $25,000 a year, it doesn't necessarily mean you have internet at home.
Ramon, do you have anything to add about how to make the AI workforce more diverse? I mean, one of the things I've heard others talk about when I've done panels like this is that, there's a hyper focus on software engineers, but there's a big team. It takes a village, I think, to build these AI systems. So are there other roles where more diverse hires can be made or encouraged?
Yes, and actually to the previous point, you're combating algorithmic bias is a very direct connection to why underrepresented individuals need to be either working with or for tech companies. And very specifically, this is why when we took that image cropping algorithm, we only tested it based on gender and race bias. Now, we knew that was probably not all the ways in which bias would manifest. We opened it up to the public, and you're right, we got feedback on religious head coverings, military camouflage, people of differing abilities. Just as an example, the image cropping algorithm would crop out individuals in wheelchairs because the people standing would be taller than them. So just the way ableist bias would manifest, which correct, nobody on my team had actually thought about that perspective. So just to highlight, this is not diversity for diversity's sake. This is diversity that is actually needed to help ensure we're combating algorithmic bias. And one of the interesting things that's happening now with generative AI is the problem space is so very vast. This is more than just saying, my team of researchers can't think about, an image cropping algorithm. Well, now it's general purpose AI can think of everything from very specific niche use cases, something more broad, something like slang or an indigenous language. So now we're seeing this practice of red teaming. About a month ago, I co-organized the largest ever generative AI red teaming exercise. And the purpose of it actually is to get perspectives of people who wouldn't be at these companies to be part of improving and engaging on improving these models. And I've been building both a for-profit and a nonprofit in order to continue doing this work. So there is actually a lot of opportunity in this new world of generative AI to bring in more diverse perspectives. And I think companies are recognizing that by design, it's needed.
Ramon, you were recently part of a Rolling Stones article, and I love the title. It was called "These Women Tried to Warn Us About AI." And I'm old enough to remember a Time magazine cover where they put 3 women whistleblowers on the cover as their persons of the year. And one of the themes of the Rolling Stone article that really jumped out at me, because these days when we hear about generative AI in the news, it paints a doomsday scenario, right? That AI is going to launch a war against humans. They're going to we're going to become extinct, kind of like Skynet in Terminator, right? And it seems that people seem more concerned about the worst case scenario than than what's going on in AI right now, the current biases that hurt women and people of color. Like, why do you think people are focused on doomsday and not what is actually happening right now?
Oh, what a great question and very timely question. Right now, there is a bit of a battle, one could say, or conflict in the responsible AI community about existential risk, this idea of robots coming alive and killing us, versus the issues that a lot of us have been talking about for years on algorithmic bias as it relates to certain demographic properties, et cetera, about people. I mean, like, all I can say is all you have to do is look at the demographics of who is in those rooms and you'll understand exactly why they think that problem is the most important, right? I mean, it's just overwhelmingly stark. Just literally Google any organization that does existential risk and any organization that does algorithmic bias, and your answer will be right there. That is why these are not individuals for whom gender bias, racial bias, economic bias is an issue because it's not their lived experience. I'll also add that it is a distraction to focus on things like, will AI come alive and kill us? Because that's, first of all, we're nowhere near AI systems that can do these things. We're absolutely nowhere near it. And even then, a lot of the scenarios that are posed, like the big one is, will AI develop nuclear capabilities and set off nuclear weapons? Actually speaks to a lack of understanding of all the infrastructure and safety and human security that is put around nuclear. Nuclear weapons are not just lying around waiting for some quote unquote magical codes to automatically set them off. That's literally not how any of this works. So much of it is a red herring to distract people from the fact that, number one, the technology is nowhere near this. So even if you are talking about it, you're actually going to be in a highly speculative space. And for some people, it's very safe to be in a speculative space because you are not tasked with solving a real problem. You are inventing imaginary problems that then you can iterate on and spin imaginary solutions for.
Marzieh or Melissa, do you have anything to add about why you think everyone is focused on doomsday and not solving biases and discrimination in AI?
I think Roman said it very well. I think if you can't imagine a world order in which you are below the very top level, the only threat to you is AI if it becomes sentient. So I think for those of us who have experienced any sort of systemic injustice. People are people, humans will human. But if you've been through a system and recognized that this system does not work systemically, right, not because of one person, but the barrel itself creates bad apples for certain kinds of people, you realize that reproducing that in an AI system that doesn't have variance, that maybe will never get an update, that might never grow or progress, would be extremely dangerous. But if you've never experienced that, if there is no systemic issue you've ever been exposed to or understood, I think it's a lot harder to imagine that it's an important risk.
And I would just add that, folks that are thinking about this, kind of like what Dr. Shardy said, is that like they're thinking so far ahead. We have issues today. We have families right now that are struggling to get food on the table. AI will impact so many jobs where people that focus on data entry or anything that's repetitive right now, those types of jobs are the ones that are at risk.
Talk more on that. I mean, what are how many people do you think, how many humans will lose their jobs? And will it disproportionately affect women and people of color?
Well, absolutely. It will certainly disproportionately affect women and people of color because those are the ones that are working those frontline jobs, right? From everyone from your cashier to your recruiting coordinator to your admin. Those are the jobs that we knew. Those are the jobs that we saw. And that's what was attainable within your family dynamics at that time. So absolutely, they're concerned about what will this mean for me? What will I do next? How will I be able to perform my job better? If I don't know about the technology that's coming, of course I'm going to be fearful of it. I don't know what to do right now. So figuring out how do I use this technology as a tool, as an asset, is something that if you're really engaged, paying attention to what's happening right now and in this moment, you're going to start asking yourself, how do I upskill myself? How do I get those skills so that I feel more comfortable with it? And some people sit down and ask those questions, and some people don't. And it's not because they don't want to, it's just because they have other pressing issues. How do I feed my kid? How do I get my kid to school today? When you have so many economic issues that are going on in your regular day, it's hard to envision the career that you want to have moving forward.
So we're starting to get questions to the audience, so keep them coming. We only have about 5 minutes left, so you're running out of time. So this is a good question. If you were in tech right now and wanted to learn skills and seek opportunities that would help combat algorithmic bias, you know what I'm trying to say. What would your first 3 steps be? Ramon, do you want to take that question on? If you were in tech right now, what skills and opportunities would you seek out so you can be part of that team that will get rid of bias in algorithms?
Well, I'll answer the question kind of a slightly different way. As I mentioned, I think the world of opportunity of who can be part of what it means to contribute to this narrative is expanding, right? So what I'm literally building right now is an independent test bed for people to be able to evaluate these models. So I think it's not even about how do I get on that team at a tech company anymore. It's actually like, what are the systems that can be built and how can regular people be part of that system in order to be able to facilitate this conversation. So I will say, like, it is a conversation with a company. It's not just about independently doing this assessment and sort of getting a headline about it. It is actually about that being structured into human feedback. And that's actually something the government's exploring as well, which is really fascinating, right? So I think we're in this new world of getting feedback from people in order to improve models. And also, I will add, compensating people for that time. It's not just kind of a free, a free thing that companies are going to get, but it's actually about compensating people for that time, which is like a very, very different paradigm.
Mm-hmm. I'm having a little trouble with my screen, so in terms of getting more questions, but I've got more questions. So everyone talks about government playing an important role in regulating AI. So I was just wondering, can regulation play a role in creating more equitable and inclusive AI? Marzieh, do you want to take on that question?
Yes. I think I'm a huge fan of regulation in general. There's a range of perspectives on this, but I think when we look at the introduction of other technology into society that has been transformative, so think about cars. Cars are transformative, right? Most people are able to drive a car, and if you don't want to get a license or can't get a license, you can now get an Uber, right? So somebody else can use this technology for you. You can pay for the service, but they're regulated. There's regulations about how they are manufactured, what standards they have to meet. These can vary state to state, but there's also federal limits, right? And then we regulate how humans have to be trained in order to use them. And now we shaped cars, right? And then cars have shaped our society, right? The way that we get to work, the way that we move around, that's all been shaped by the tool. So I think it's very important that we have these federal structures, these regulatory structures that understand how humans should be able to interact with AI, not in a research capacity where we're developing and testing things in a university, but in a deployment setting, right? When you're trying to develop the windshield wiper or a better steering system, that's fine. Nobody is saying that's dangerous for a car. When you're actually driving a car and people are using it on a highway, you need to know how it's going to be used and what kinds of things are okay in general. What is the speed limit? How do we make sure people are responsible when they're engaging with it?
Ramon, what does regulation look like for you in AI, whether it's in general or in to create a more equitable system?
I think this is the topic of conversation, as I mentioned here in UN General Assembly. It's been the topic of conversation in DC. Last Wednesday, I was at the first AI Insights Forum that was led by Senator Chuck Schumer, and it was basically I was jokingly called the most expensive meeting in history because every major tech CEO and like a couple of us who do nonprofits and civil society work. I think that's a question that's being explored. So a few things is one, how what should it look like? Some people like Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, say that there should be licensing. Other people say that there should be some sort of norms or regulation, consumer protection. Others say that we need a totally new body within the US government in order to regulate it the way other countries have. I think it's a question that's up in the air, but I think ultimately I should hope that, and one of the things I emphasize, that it should specifically focus on reducing bad outcomes and reducing harms, but also how do we think about ensuring we are mapping a pathway to doing good. And the two of those things are actually different from each other. Like one can not do bad, and that's fine, and you're maintaining status quo. But if the purpose and point of this technology is to do good, well, let's make sure that doing good is not just profit in the pockets of people running big companies, but doing good is problems that are being solved that are public benefit problems. I think sometimes it is assumed, and we've seen CEOs say things like AI will solve poverty. Nothing just automatically solves poverty. Maybe the technology in some way could be used to do that, but it has to be intentional. So my hope is that at least U.S. government, global government, everyone's talking about it right now. But I hope that we're talking about stopping bad things, but also building good things.
Rumaan, this is probably the only chance I get to say this, but you were at the UN General Assembly. The best excuse for not being here in person. So tell me about, is there another country in the world that's leading on regulating AI, making a better AI?
Well, the European Union has actually led the way with the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, and possibly the AI Act, which is still up in the air. But I've specifically been working with the European Center on Algorithmic Transparency on the Digital Services Act. I think it's really interesting about it is from a technical auditing perspective, it opens up doors for folks like myself and independent auditors to assess these platforms for things like violations of fundamental human rights, impact on democracy and democratic processes, mental health, and gender-based violence, which is actually like a very bold move. And it's fascinating. I mean, all these geopolitical reasons are why it comes out of the EU and maybe wouldn't come out of somewhere like the US. So we have the EU. We also have the UK that has been for years investing in responsible AI, and has announced this summit happening in November. Although one of the critiques is that it's become very dominated with this existential risk narrative versus the responsible AI narrative. So what's happening now is there are a lot of folks convening in countries around the world. So the US isn't alone. The other one I'll add is Singapore. Singapore has been working on responsible AI for many years. They've actually done some really, really interesting work. And in part because the primary industry in Singapore, one of the primary industries is banking. And banking has had rules and regulations around fairness. Like banking fairness is a thing that predates the use of algorithms in the way we understand it. So it's very fascinating to see countries around the world approaching these problems with different perspectives. The last part I'll add is this is something the UN is talking about, right? The OECD is talking about. So there's global governance, there's national governance, and then there's what's happening at the local level as well.
All right, one more question on this, Rumaan, which is, government wasn't very good at regulating big tech. How confident are you that that government will rein in AI?
That's an interesting question and kind of a constant topic of conversation. I mean, the realistic picture is these companies have more wealth and power than any given nation, right? And this is why the narrative has moved to global governance rather than a single country governing. TBD, right? So now there's a lot of conversation about openness and transparency, access to algorithms. So as I mentioned, Digital Services Act, one of the most revolutionary parts of it is it actually says companies need to give access to their code and data to external auditors to assess these models. That is one way countries can exert power over these companies. But I think it's just TBD because we are working. There is the word we've been using is coopetition. Companies are working with governments. It is also a little bit of it's not a pure competition. It's not pure cooperation. It's something in between, right? These companies want to build products people will use. Unlike the era of platforms, it's actually not at odds with their revenue model, but also there's only so much oversight that they're willing to have. So I think that's a problem that's currently being hashed out literally in real time.
Mm-hmm. All right, one last question for me. So it's the year 2033, right, or about 10 years in the future. We've been all talking about generative AI for the past decade. And so let's say we get it right. Let's say government sets up the right regulation. Let's say AI is rolled out more fairly and equitably. What does that look like to you in your respective fields? Marzia, why don't you start?
I think if we get it right, what it could look like is closer to personalized healthcare. So when you go to the doctor and you ask about relevant risks for you as an individual, you get forecasts about what you are likely to experience and what kind of preventative measures are actually going to work for you, rather than guesses based on, well, to the best of our knowledge, right? And so we can take all the data that we have and actually predict what is a meaningful recommendation for each individual to have the healthiest life.
All right, with 30 seconds. Sorry.
If you get it right, you can have personalized career plans. You should be able to follow your curiosity and be able to feed that curiosity every day.
All right, Ramon, you got the last word. What does it look like? What does the future look like? Oh, wait, did we cut her off? Oh.
The future, oh, I was muted. The future looks like an open, wide open playing field, and we get to decide how it's navigated.
All right, well, this session flew by fast. Thank you for everyone for being here today. Marzia, Melissa, Ramon, joining us from the UN General Assembly. Thank you for taking part in this year's Globe Summit. We still have some terrific sessions coming up and also into tomorrow and Thursday. Check out the full schedule at globe.com/summit.